Okay, chapter 14 is on competition. So we're done with nasty parasites and now talking about competition. Key concepts for this chapter is that competition can be direct or indirect, vary in intensity, and occur between similar or dissimilar species. Competing species are more likely to coexist when they use resources in different ways. And competitive interactions can be modeled using the logistic equation. And the outcome of this competition can be altered by the physical environment, disturbance, and predation. This is kind of a case study looking at carnivorous plants. So Darwin was the first to document carnivory in plants. And there was over 600 species of plants that use a variety of mechanisms to eat animals. It's sort of interesting that this has evolved multiple times, and so those 600 species aren't necessarily closely related, that it's more of an example of convergent evolution where different dissimilar plants have developed this mechanism. The Venus flytrap leaves have an inner surface with touch-sensitive hairs, and so if an insect trips the hairs, the leaf says snaps shut, but half a second isn't really snapping shut in my opinion, but nonetheless it closes at a rate to trap the animal. And pitcher plants have a modified trap with a downward facing hair so that insects can crawl in but not crawl out. And there's a layer of wax that helps them slide down, so then they fall into a vat of digestive juices. And so, this raises the question of, well, why aren't plants doing plant things? Why are they doing carnivory? You're a plant. You're supposed to do plant things. Well, this is an adaptation to competition. That competition among plants can be intense, particularly where soil nutrients are scarce and animals are full of nutrients. They have a lot of nitrogen, phosphorus, and other important nutrients the plant needs. And so in nutrient-poor environments, plant carnivories have evolved multiple times and suggest an adaptation to low nutrient environments. So they've basically figured out a way of getting lots of nutrients that the other plants in their environment can't. And so that's giving them a competitive advantage. And it's a way of adapting to this competition over a limited resource, in this case, nutrients. And so as a way of adapting to a low nutrient world, these plants have figured out how to gain nutrients. That's different than direct competition with other members of similar species. They're kind of all going for the small pool of typically like nitrogen and phosphorus. And this is a study looking at the role of competition in the carnivorous plant. And so here they had pitcher plants in a variety of environments, and they tried them. They tried removing neighbors and not. And so in this example, they have neighbors present, and here neighbors are removed. And with the removal of neighbors, they had an increase in growth. And so there's some competition that leads to decreased growth in this plant. When we remove competitors, it does better. It's a pretty common idea. It's just a way of showing that in this particular studies. And the neighbor removal increased plant growth, especially when animal prey were available. So when there's animals available to eat, they had even a bigger difference between when neighbors are present and when neighbors are removed. So the impact of competition can be thought of as the difference between this bar and this bar, or this bar and this bar, meaning competition is driving down the overall biomass of pitcher plants, and without competition, they can grow a lot larger. So there's clearly some impact of competition. We could think of this like it was like maybe one mechanism for density dependence, right? That's a way of thinking about competition. That there's more of you tend to grow slower because you're competing for the same resources. So this is one way of visualizing that. So competition is non-trophic interaction between individuals of two or more species in which all species are negatively affected by their shared use of a resource. Non-trophic interaction means it's not a predator-prey interaction. It can be a competition around food, but non-trophic meaning it's not that the mice populations go down because hawk populations go up. So that's what they mean by non-trophic. It can still, for sure, involve food. And because we're using the word resource here to mean food, nutrients, space, light, water, anything that the organism needs to survive is considered to be a resource. Now, interspecific means competition means between different species. We'll look at a couple examples, but it could be like barnacles and mussels competing for space on a rock. Okay, space is a resource. That's an interspecific competition. Now, an intraspecific competition means between individuals of a single species. So intraspecific competition could be looking at a specific genus and species of barnacle fighting for space on that same rock. So you can have inter and interspecific, inter and intraspecific competition really on the same space. Resources, again, that's largely anything. Components of the environment, food, water, light, space, anything that's required by that species. Trying to think of like where air could be limiting, but anything that the organism needs to survive that presumably occurs in scarcity, right? A fundamental niche is the full sweat of resources plus biotic and abiotic requirements of the species. We looked at this earlier in some of the climate modeling and species distributions, but there's kind of like fundamental niche is based on first principles. This organism requires this kind of light, this kind of soil, this kind of climate. And so we can model where we would expect to see that organism based on those parameters. Now, life is not always ideal. And so the difference between the idealized niche or the fundamental niche is the realized niche. And so a realized niche is a restricted set of resources that limits the species 2 due to species interactions. Okay, realized niche is saying there's all these places I could live, and here's where I actually do live. And fundamental and realized niches can be pretty much quite different. It's driven by, we often or we'll look at it through competition or through a biological realm, meaning there's lots of places we would like to be, but if we go over there, we get out-competed. And so realized niche can be on the margins of their idealized niche, but it's basically where we find them, where if we removed the impact of competition, they would exist in a much larger area. So there's some degree of competition that's limiting their distribution. So we can think of this as the fundamental niche for species 1. If we're looking at 2 resources, light and nutrients, this organism can exist in this large area. But we start to look at competition with 5 other species, and maybe these species are better competitors. Maybe they can grow higher and shade out species 1. And so if all these other species, all these other competitors are taller with a larger canopy, they're going to shade out species 1. So species 1 would live in this big, broad area that has abundant light and soil conditions. However, in all of these areas where species 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 exist, they outcompete species 1. So species 1 is just found in a small subset of its fundamental niche. The fundamental niche being where it could exist. However, competition limits it from growing in those areas, and so it only exists in its realized niche. So if we remove species 2 and 3, then the realized niche would increase to this area as well. So again, using like light and nutrients as an example, one way I think of this is maybe species 1 is a low shrub. These are all tree species that grow up and overshade that low shrub that requires a lot of light. Species may compete indirectly by exploitation competition. Individuals reduce the supply of resource as they use it. Now, in the example of pitcher plants is the competition and the growing faster without neighbors. And so if the number of bugs was limiting, they're not directly fighting for one another, but they're using the same resource. And so if one is using a lot of the resource, then there's less left over for the others. Is this the one that I had? One second here. Oh, I had some. Sorry, I had some other examples for where'd that go? Give me one second here. Sorry, I thought I had one other example there, but I was thinking about one of the next topics we're going to come to. Another way of thinking of that is grazers. So anytime you've got what's the thing I'm looking at, the invisible hand, tragedy of the commons. Anytime you have a resource out there and individuals can consume it, if they're exploiting it at a higher rate than other members of their species or other similar species or other competitors, there's some form of competition here. And so you could think of a grassland and a number of grazers on it, deer, cow, whatever it might be, that when one is consuming that food, that grass, it's reducing the amount of resources for the other, either inter or intra-specific competitors. And so if it's deer and elk, maybe they're competing for the same food resource. If it's a herd of black-tailed deer, then they're competing with one another. So anytime species are competing, that compete indirectly via exploitation competition, meaning there's a limited amount of resource and individuals are competing to gain as much of that resource as possible. Whether it be things like light or food or nutrients, those are all examples of exploitation competition. And species may compete directly through interference competition. One species directly interferes with the ability of its competitors to use a limiting resource. Carnivores fighting over an animal prey, or herbivorous voles aggressively excluding other species from their preferred habitat. So you can think of like setting up a home range, defending that home range. You're interfering with other members of your species or other competitors from coming into that home range. You're interfering to keep them out as a form of competition. So you're setting up a home range, you're fighting, you're removing individuals from a certain area through direct contact, direct interaction. We can also look at this in plants, and this is kind of a good example as well. The interference competition in plants, individuals of one species grow on or shade other species, reducing their access to light. And we'll look at the kudzu here in a second. So sort of similar to this, to what I laid out for the example of the realized niche versus the I was going to say potential niche, but I want to use the right word. They use a slightly different word than I would think of. Where did it go? Fundamental niche, where you can have a plant that has a large fundamental niche, but its realized niche is much smaller because of interference by competing plants that grow above it and shade it out. So that would be one example of interference competition in plants. And allelopathy is when plants of one species release toxins to harm other species. Locally, madrona do that. In Canada, known as arbutus. Arbutus menenzii. It's that really cool tree you see on the coastlines that has like the peeling bark, kind of a red color. Their leaves have a toxin in it. So often you'll find a madrona and you'll see a bunch of dead leaves around and very little things growing below it. So that's an example of allelopathy. Here's that vine, that kudzu, growing over and covering a bunch of trees and shrubs in Georgia. So you can kind of tell below, you can see the vine everywhere. This vine is completely taken over the system. Now it's shading out all these trees and bushes. The vine's using those for structure to grow on, but it's throwing out these big leaves that are impacting the plants they're growing on's ability to access light energy. So here they're interfering. They're directly interacting with its competitors, in this case covering it up, capturing all the resources, in this case light, at a detriment or the cost to those it's competing with. So we can think of interference competition as here we've got competitor 1 and competitor 2. They're directly interacting. They're somehow waging war, competing with one another in a direct manner, growing on top of each other, fighting, pushing out for home ranges. Or if we look at exploitive competition, we can have competitor 1 and competitor 2. They're both vying for the same resource. Cows and sheep in a field together, they both want the grass. So they're competing with one another indirectly. The dash line here means indirect. So they're not going around bumping each other in the head, pushing each other out of the field. But when one's consuming the resource, grass, that means there's less grass for the other one to get. So it's you can think of it as direct competition versus indirect competition. The mechanism for that would be interference competition for direct competition, pushing one another out of the way, growing up over, things like that, where exploitive competition is trying to get that resource as fast as possible in the best way possible at the detriment to other competitors. So competition intensity can vary depending on the resource availability and type. Plants may compete above and below ground. So above ground resources, we think of things like light. Below ground resources are things like water, and particularly nutrients are really important. And so we often look at the above ground, biomass, shading, things like that. But in the roots, there's a whole lot of things going on as well to fight over nutrients. And so here we can look at this index of competition intensity in a low nitrogen and a high nitrogen environment. And so here in a low nitrogen environment, there's more competition intensity. And I believe this is, this is the below ground. This is above ground competition intensity. So this should say below ground on it. Below ground. So they use a metric for competition intensity. Likely things like roots, like root mass, how far out that how much energy they put into root formation, extent of roots formation, things like that are all forms of trying to spread out your footprint so you can gain as much nitrogen as possible. So in low nitrogen environments, there's more competition. And when we look at light availability, in low lights, there's more competition intensity for light availability. Shooting a stalk straight up and then trying to shade out that way would be one way of thinking about it. Where in an abundant light, maybe there's smaller, shorter, bushier plant types. Where in a low light environment, you could have individuals, putting all their energy into shooting straight up and then putting their leaves up as high as possible in an effort to shade out other individuals. Where in an abundant light resource, maybe they're more compact. So that'd be one way of thinking about above ground competition for light. Competition reduces the availability of resources for both species, and abundance of both is reduced to some extent. So if we're talking about interspecific competition, competition's reducing resources for both species. There's a negative impact for both of them, and there's some reduction. But effects of competition are often unequal or asymmetrical. One species might be harmed more than other. So we can think about competition strength and like a good competitor versus a bad competitor. One species is able to outcompete the other, and this can drive one species to extinction. So the main concepts here are that competition is not free. Even if you're the better competitor, there's still a cost to competing. And if you're the inferior competitor, that cost might be extinction. And we typically think about that more on the localized level as opposed to like the absolute level, like a localized extinction. So here we're looking at two different species of diatoms. So we have this one, and the blue is the diatom concentration, and then I think that's red is the silica concentration. So Syndra grows up quickly, consumes all of the silica content. These are diatoms. They live in glass houses, so they need silica to grow. So this species is able to withdraw or pull silica out to very low levels, and it obtains a diatom density, cells per milliliter, of kind of a moderate amount compared to Astronella, which maintains a higher biomass, more cells per liter, but cannot draw silica all the way down to zero. So they grow really quickly. There's more of them, but they're not able to scavenge silica to a near zero level. When we put them together, what we see is the species that's able to use that last little bit of silica, they're able to survive, and the species that is not winds up tanking. So even though alone you would expect that Astronella would be the better competitor because they can grow faster and have a higher biomass compared to Syndra, that when you put them together, Syndra is a better competitor because it's able to use that last little bit. So you can think of it as Astronella can draw the tank down to like 90%, and Syndra, I'm terrible at species names. Syndra can survive on that last 10% of the tank, and so they're able to use just that very small amount of silica that's left in the environment. They're able to more efficiently scavenge or bring in silica compared to Astronella, which can't pull silica down below some smaller amount. This is silica concentration below 2 or 3 micromoles per liter. So in that instance where resources become very limited, Syndra does better. So because of that localized extinction of Astronella. So because it's able to draw silica down to a level that Astronella can't survive, it's able to outcompete its competitor by being able to scavenge silica at a high rate and survive at lower levels of silica. And so there's a continuum of how strong each competitor affects each other. Oh, sorry, there's one more point here. It's not as pronounced. So look at the difference in biomass of the blue line here. Yeah, it's not as pronounced. Okay. There's a continuum of how strong each competitor affects one another. And the ends of this continuum is amens. I practiced this before. It's like amen, amens elia, amenzelism, amen, lism, amenzelism, amenzelism, which has a negative zero interaction. What that means is amenzelism negatively impacts, so you have two species interacting. Amenzelism negatively impacts one and the other one doesn't care, effectively. So this is interactions where individuals of one species are harmed and the other species is not affected at all. Let me see if we go to some examples of that. Or you can imagine a goat going over and eating a shrub. He's eating it, just mount away in the shrub. It's totally fine. Well, that shrub is habitat for a shrub-loving beetle. So now that beetle has less resources. It's negatively impacted. There's no harm to the goat based on the beetle being there. The beetle can be there, just hanging out doing whatever, and so there's no impact. There's no negative impact from beetle populations declining on the goat. The goat is negatively impacting the beetle's population by consuming its resource. Another example could be algae blooms. If we have a really strong algal bloom in Lake Padden and the water turns green, and those algae are just taking over, and that winds up driving dissolved oxygen levels down, and it kills all the fish. So there's a negative interaction between the algae and the fish. So algae bloom causes fish to die. The algae doesn't really care if the fish are there or not. So there's no negative impact to the fish dying or no positive really benefit for that fish dying. So you can think of it as some form. I think the goat one's probably better. A goat eating a shrub negatively impacts the beetle, and the beetle doesn't really impact the goat at all. So we can think of this on the competition on this continuum. So typically, this could be the size of the graph is representative of how big that population is. So we have competition. So if we start off with species 1, it's doing very well, and that's driven this other species to extinction, and it's not really impacting species 1. That could be a form of amensalism. So goat, beetle. Competition would be here in the middle where both populations are declined. So you could think of this as our cows and sheep in a field together. They're competing for resources. And then on the other end, another form of amensalism. Let's see what we got. We got a couple more slides here. So this is that study looking at competition between distantly related species. And this is the exclusion experiment where rodents and ants eat the same type of seeds. And whether rodents or ants were removed, the group that remained ate as many seeds as rodents and ants combined. And so what this is saying is that these are direct competitors. And so if we exclude rodents from a plot and allow the ants to go, they're going to eat as many seeds as the control plot that has mice and ants in it, and vice versa. If we exclude ants, the mice are going to eat as many seeds as the ants and mice combined in the control plot, indicating that they're competing for one another. There's a few differences here where ants can eat some of the smaller seeds, but generally there's a pretty big overlap between their diets. So how is competition important? Many studies have been compiled and analyzed to answer this question. Schrodner in 1983 found that 390 species studied, 76% showed effects of competition under some conditions, and 57 showed effects under all conditions. Joe Connell, the famous intertidal ecologist, found that competition was important for 50% of the 215 species in 72 studies. And Gurvich analyzed the magnitude of competition in 93 species in 46 studies, and competition had a significant impact on them. However, this is based on the published literature, and we typically are not able to publish negative results, meaning if we do a study and say, oh, there's no competition, it's less hard to publish than here's some competition. And generally when we go out to study species interactions, we're going to pick study sites that have species interactions, and so we'll be looking for areas that have that. But still, there's strong evidence that competition exists, and we've recorded it. All right, that's it for the first part of chapter 14.